Once, when I was a kid, some 600 or 700 years ago, Dad took us all in the station wagon to Tennessee to live in a tent and go fishing for 3 days. But when we got to the Missouri-Tennessee border, he stopped the car and we all got out because this was so cool. I had 1 foot in Missouri and 1 foot in Tennessee, and I thought that was great. The man we listen to today is a person who lived with his feet in 2 very different worlds. It is the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. And I've often talked about Peter because I just love him. He had such a big heart and such enthusiasm, and he would mess things up so badly, but he would then be sorry and try all over again. And I've loved to talk about him. But today, I want to talk about Paul. We begin today, worldwide, the year of Paul, even though the new church year normally begins and does begin in Advent. From now until next June 29th will be the year of Paul. We believe that this is about the 2000th anniversary of his birth. And so I want to focus today a bit on the wisdom and the challenge of that man. Paul had his feet firmly planted in his Jewish faith. And so there was for him one true God only. And he was also a Roman citizen. A citizen of an empire that had little use for a God and called its citizens to worship the emperor. For Paul, then, the identity challenge: how do you keep your faith and identity in this one true God, in this encroaching pagan world all around him? Now, as a Jew of his day, Paul looked with disdain on this upstart movement of these followers of Jesus called the people of the way. He went so far as to persecute them. And I bet pretty much everybody here knows the story of how he was changed, how he was knocked off his horse by a light. And the voice that came to him, because this time his name was Saul, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Who are you? He came to know that voice was the voice of Jesus. And he began to study about this man, talked to people who had actually met him, listened to the teachings. And what happened for Saul was that he began to love this man, and even more so, love what this man loved. He loved the world vision that this man Jesus had. And he was such a changed man that he even changed his name from Saul to Paul. He had found something and someone worth his life. He took on the worldview of Jesus and would become in many ways its preacher. He would be the one to proclaim this great message of Jesus and his view of the world. I mean, how could you be silent in the face of such a kingdom? Now, if Jesus was the architect and beginner of a new kingdom, Paul was its builder. Jesus named the vision, but Jesus did not name concretely very often how it had to actually be figured out to live it. For example, in the early days of the church, all followers of Jesus were Jewish originally. And those who were more conservative in that tradition would say, and it must be that way. But Paul felt that we had to be broadened out to the Gentiles. And there were some very difficult debates. But in the end, and thank goodness, Paul won a broader view took over, and people who were not first Jews were allowed also to become followers of Jesus. But what Paul would do would be take this vision of Jesus and then help us figure out how we would actually live it in the concrete situations of our lives. Paul saw himself as a pioneer, going to places who had never heard of Jesus and who had never even imagined anything as crazy as the story of a young, crucified Jew who was king and lord of the world, and that Caesar was not the king and lord of the world. And Paul preached and preached and preached. And while I could never summarize his message, it's dangerous to try to boil it down. Perhaps there were two key things that need to be named. One, Paul would preach again and again that the power in us is not because of us. It's not because we are so strong. As a matter of fact, he would say, it is when we are weak that the glory of God can shine through us. Paul said, don't think for a second you can earn salvation. Don't think you can make God love you, or by keeping the law you make yourself good. You are already loved. You don't have to earn it. He has died for us, and it is in the weakness of us that the glory of God shines through. So we can't earn it. It's already there. And then secondly, that has to show up in how we live. We have to be people who show the world an allegiance to a different king than the normal powers of the world. Now, this word that he would proclaim did a strange thing in human hearts and lives. And one of Paul's greatest legacy would be these little cells of people that would come together. People who had no real affinity, very different people, bound together by the belief in a different kind of king. These cells had as their purpose to show the world a different way. The two qualities of these little cells that I would highlight: one, they were always communities of equals. While the people were very different, Paul would always say, there is no Jew or Greek here, There's no slave or free here. There's no rich or poor, man or woman. We are all equally loved by God. And those little communities, if they were wealthier, would take up collections to help take care of those that were not as wealthy, because we're equal. And we had to show to the world this. And secondly, the second quality of these little cells, they were dangerous. They were subversive. In the Roman Empire, who held up the emperor as king, these little cells were so bold as to say, there is another king right under the nose of Caesar. They would encourage people to have allegiance not to Caesar, but to a different king. And the dream was that people would so see how these people lived that their allegiance to the state would crumble, because people would be so in awe of the power and beauty to be found alive in these little cells of believers and in how they lived. As Paul would move to the next place to preach, he would hear stories that some of the communities weren't living it so well, so he would write them letters, or epistles. And those are the readings that we hear from proclaimed here, the epistles of St. Paul. We often hear his letters back to those communities. He's almost always telling them not to sleep with power. You can't live that way. You got to live the values of Jesus. And that brings us to us. My brothers and sisters, in some ways, we are one of those little cells, although we're not so little. In ways we are very different. This particular gathering of people, and this is true in pretty much any church, would never have come together just of its own. We come from different socio-economic backgrounds, although most of us here are much better off than most of the world that way. We come from different political bents, different temperaments, different races, different sports allegiances. I even saw a Cub fan last night. But I hope that it's clear that we are equals here. We have different jobs and roles, But I hope that you know you're not new or long time, young or old, black or white, rich or poor. We are all equally beloved of God here. I think we live that pretty well, and I hope that's clear. But I wonder sometimes if we have that second quality down well enough. Are we subversive enough? Are we dangerous at all to the powers of this world? Or are we just like everybody else? The vision Paul proclaimed would be a people who would not show allegiance to flag, our state, our powers that be, but would show allegiance to one only and to the crucified King and his way of living. Are our lives any different? What do we say as a people to this world about poverty and wealth? What do we say to the world about loving the immigrant, the unborn, the gay, the imprisoned, the outcast? Do we just fall lockstep with the kings and powers of this day? Or do we serve a different king? Can the world see that? And the reason we gather as a cell like this again and again is to hear the word proclaimed to us again, to be strengthened in sacrament, to show the world an allegiance to a different king. And I worry sometimes about how much people can see him in how we live. When it was time for me to be confirmed, I chose as a confirmation name Paul. I didn't think I was very much like him. He had such strength and seemed so confident, and I felt so scared so often. And he seemed so articulate, and I felt like my words would stumble out of me. But there was a strength in him that I wanted. And now here, I end up doing much of what he did, preaching and preaching and preaching and praying it makes a difference. And at the end of my life, I hope I can say what he said in the reading we just heard from him today. It was the end of his life. He'd been in prison, many things had fallen apart, and he said, I fought the good fight. I've run the race. And I believe that there is a crown that awaits me in the life beyond this life. And I pray that I could say that at the end of my life. As we begin this year dedicated to St. Paul, I pray that we will keep gathering like this, listening to the word, being strengthened by one another, that we might witness to the world a community of equals who serves no king but that king, that man that Paul loved so much. Boys and girls, let's see what Big Al is thinking about these days. Hello. Well, hello, buddy. How are you? I'm great. You're great. Glad to hear it. So, Big Al, if I were to ask you, what have you been thinking about these days? What's one of the things you've been thinking about? Getting what? What tattoo? Getting a tattoo. Dude, why would you do that? Be different, be different. You are already different. You too. Well, okay, all right. But Big Al, I don't think that's such a good idea. In some ways, that's just almost like trying to fit in. It's almost like the same, just trying to fit into everybody else. Big Al, there is one way that I really want you to be different, though. Oh, Big Al, I want you to be like Jesus, even if people right around you aren't. What? Well, let me give you an example. Suppose people were picking on somebody. What's one way that you could be like Jesus there? What would you say? Stand with him. Go stand with him? Oh, Big Al, that would be perfect. That would be different than what the others were doing, but that would show that you belong to Jesus, Big Al. I love that. It's our job to show the world that we belong to Jesus, and that's why we come here, to get strengthened to love like him. Cool. Go Cards. And boys and girls, we pray for you so much that even if the people around you aren't, that you will be like Jesus and love like him